We're setting off this morning on a new journey. This is a journey that will take us back in time, some 2,700 years, and it's off to a land in the Middle East that we're going. That is some 6,000 miles away from where we are here in New York City. That's the journey we're taking as we come to the Old Testament book of Daniel this morning, and we begin this new sermon series in the book of Daniel. The events in the book of Daniel, they take place over a 70-year span, roughly from 605 to 539 BC. And they take place in the ancient city of Babylon, which is just outside of modern-day Baghdad. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and so this is where we're going to be for the next 4 months or so, Lord willing. Now, if we just kind of step back and we consider what's the overarching theme of the book of Daniel? What's that melodic line that runs through this book? And it kind of holds it all together. And the answer to that is that this is a book that's all about, really, kings and kingdoms. That's the melodic line in the book of Daniel. On almost every page, you'll find some sort of reference to a king or a kingdom. And therefore, as a result, one of the issues that this book raises for us is a question about our identity and our allegiance. Right? If it's all about kings and kingdoms, then there's a question of my allegiance. There's a question of my identity. Which kingdom do I belong to? Which king do I bow the knee to and worship? And because of that, this study in the book of Daniel is, I think, challenging for us in a couple of ways. It poses a couple of challenges to us. And one of those challenges is that this very issue of allegiance, it doesn't resonate well in our culture. In the sense that we're a culture that doesn't like to think that we come under the authority of another. We're a culture that doesn't do well with the idea of kings over us. We like to think that the only person we really owe allegiance to is ourselves. That's kind of the mantra of the day, I think. We're to be true to ourselves. We're not to let others determine who we are. We are the masters of our own destiny. We don't owe allegiance to anyone other than ourselves. And yet the book of Daniel challenges us on that, and it forces us to reckon with the reality that we belong to God, and that we're to come under God's authority. So I don't know if that's easy for a lot of us to hear, just given the cultural air that we breathe. It's not easy to have our independence and our autonomy challenged in that kind of way. So that's one challenge, but the other challenge we're faced with as we come to the book of Daniel is a tension that many Christians feel in this world. And a tension that, no doubt, Daniel himself surely felt. And that's the tension of sort of feeling like we have dual allegiances in this world. I mean, this is the feeling that we know we belong to God, we bow the knee in worship to Him and His kingship, and yet here we are in this world that many times feels like it's godless, and so we find ourselves being pulled in several different directions all at once. And so there's a tension there. And it's a tension that becomes even more acute the more we realize that we have, yes, some sort of home in this world, but our citizenship really is in heaven. And so in one sense, yes, this world is our home, and yet we sense that it's not our home. And so that creates a tension for us as we live our life in this world. And it's these two challenges that we are faced with head-on in this opening chapter of Daniel. Now, there are 12 total chapters in this book, and one of the very simple ways that you could outline this book is simply to divide it in half. The first 6 chapters, they deal with a lot of narrative and historical events that take place in Daniel's life during the time when God's people were in exile. And so all of this is coming after King David and King Solomon, most of the kings in Israel's history. So you could outline it and say, well, the first half is all about the historical narrative parts of Daniel and his life, while chapters 7 through 12, though, they deal with a lot of dreams and visions that Daniel has, and this typically gets identified as apocalyptic literature. So that's one way. That's a simple way you could outline the book. But another way to outline the book, which captures a bit more of its complexity, I think, is to see chapters 2 through 7 as being the core of the book, with chapters 8 to 12 then expounding on the big picture of what's taking place in the earlier chapters. And one reason for doing that is because chapters 2 through 7 are actually written in a different language than the rest of the book. Chapters 2 to 7, roughly, are written in Aramaic, while the rest of the book is written in Hebrew. And so there's obviously something different going on with chapters 2 through 7. But then what happens when you do that is that chapter 1 becomes really the introductory chapter for the whole of the book. It's sort of the prelude for everything that's to come. And it sets the stage for everything else that we're going to see in the rest of this book. And so I think that's how we should look at it here this morning, that this opening chapter is really the introduction to the rest of the book. It's the prelude, which means that the themes we see here in chapter 1 should be the themes that we expect to encounter as we move our way through Daniel, and that's exactly what we find. And there are three themes in particular that all cling to this melodic line of kings and kingdoms, and we're introduced to those three themes here in chapter 1. And they teach us what this book is all about. And so my plan for us today, I want to walk through these three themes that we see here as an introduction for us as we move through the rest of this book over the next few months. And as we do so, I think it's helpful because with each of these themes, there's really an application question that's very relevant for us today, that each of these themes is answering. So let me give you the questions up front, and then we'll walk through and look at these themes. The first question is this: what do you do when your world falls apart? It's one of the questions that the book of Daniel is trying to answer. What do you do when your world falls apart? A second question is, how should you live in this world? And a third question that Daniel tries to answer is, what in the world is God up to? What is this all about? What's the purpose? Okay, three perennial questions asked by, I think, Christians in all ages. Three questions repeatedly brought to the surface in this book, and three questions introduced to us here in the opening chapter. So friends, may the Lord give us grace and wisdom and clarity as we seek to give Him our wholehearted allegiance. So the first question is, what do you do when your world falls apart? And the answer that the book of Daniel gives to that question is, you need to remind yourself that God is in charge. We'd be wrong to conclude that the book of Daniel is all about Daniel. We'd be forgiven for doing so. It's called Daniel, but it's not about Daniel. I'm sure we've heard many of the stories, Daniel in the lion's den, and we have some idea maybe of Daniel going through these exciting events in his life. Maybe if you grew up in a Sunday school, you learned the song, "Dare to be a Daniel." But actually, Daniel's not the real hero of the story. He's not actually the focus. The real hero of the story is God. Daniel is a man who is himself centered on God. The book of Daniel is all about God. It's God who's in charge that we see here. It's God who rules. It's God who's sovereign. Look at these verses from chapter 1. Repeatedly, we're told that it's God who's at work in all of the events of this chapter. Okay, so verse 2, how did the people of Israel end up in exile? The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Or verse 9, how was Daniel able to stand firm in Babylon? Well, because God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Verse 17, how was Daniel able to have so much success? Well, because God gave Daniel and his friends learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Right, you see, the repeated emphasis is that God's at work. God is the one who is ordering events. He's directing events. He's present there with His people. And He's working His purposes out among them. And so as we come to these opening verses of this book, we see not only the historical details of everything that was taking place at that time, but we also see the theological interpretation of those details. Okay, so what you have there in verse 1, those are the basic facts of history. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That's what happened. It's two earthly kings, King Jehoiakim and King Nebuchadnezzar, and King Nebuchadnezzar comes and he beats King Jehoiakim. So beginning in the year 605, it's exactly what happened. Babylon, under the leadership of one of the great and mighty kings in ancient history, Nebuchadnezzar, after having soundly defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish, has now come and soundly defeated the Israelites. And it begins this 3-stage process in which Jerusalem is destroyed and the temple is destroyed, and the Israelites are taken out of Jerusalem and they're taken into Babylon. It wouldn't ultimately end until 587, but it begins here in 605. This is the beginning of the end. And those are the historical facts. But notice here that the it's not simply interested in the bare facts of history. The Bible also gives us a theological interpretation of those facts. And so we need to ask, well, where was God in the midst of all of this destruction of Jerusalem? Well, verse 2 tells us, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And Nebuchadnezzar brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God." Okay, so the theological interpretation of these historical events is that they're God's doing. It was the Lord God who was at work in the destruction of his own city. It was the Lord God who was at work in the destruction of his own temple. It was the Lord God who was at work in allowing his people to be carried off and in allowing, notice, his very name to be smeared and mocked. As he allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take the very holy vessels from God's temple in Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar takes them, and Nebuchadnezzar puts them in his own temple, a temple that was undoubtedly devoted to the Babylonian god Marduk. And so if you just take the bare facts of history, you see it looks as if Nebuchadnezzar's God has won. As if God himself has been defeated. Right? That's what it symbolizes. When he takes those vessels out of the temple in Jerusalem and he puts them in his God's temple, it's saying, our God is better than your God. We beat you. That's what it looks like on the surface. And yet we see that it's God's hand that's behind all of this. God gave Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, why did God do this? It's because he's faithful to his word. Right? The exile and the destruction of Jerusalem, this is precisely what God said would happen. He gave his people many warnings. This was part of the very covenant that he made with the Israelites when Moses led them out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them, and there were blessings and there were curses tied to this covenant. And God said very specifically, if you do not follow my law, if you do not worship me, if you do not obey me, an enemy is going to come in, and they're going to destroy the walls of this place, and you're going to be carried off to serve the enemy. And that's what happened. God was faithful to what he promised. And thus the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Now Daniel begins here with this vital point. Because you see, for many of the Israelites, what seemed to be taking place on the surface, understandably in some ways, was that their entire world was falling apart. I mean, for the Israelites, everything revolved around a number of things. The land was everything. It gave them their identity. Not only that, but the temple was everything. It was the symbol of God's presence with them. And even more, the king sitting in the throne of David, in the line of David, when God would fulfill all these promises that they were expecting to the line of David. So many promises were tied to that Davidic kingship. You got the land, you got the temple, you got the king, and now they're all gone. Their entire world, as they understood, was falling apart. Not only that, but one of the things we also have to understand is that Jerusalem and Babylon couldn't be more different in the Bible. I mean, this is a tale of two very different cities representing two very different realities. Both are obviously literal cities, or they're capitals of their respective kingdoms. But throughout the Bible, Jerusalem and Babylon also signify the two allegiances that separate people. Think of the way the Bible talks, that there are two gates in which you might enter. There are two roads that you might take in life. Jerusalem and Babylon represent those two allegiances that people can choose from in their life. And so ultimately, Jerusalem comes to signify the people of God who would gather around what would be called Mount Zion and the heavenly city of God. And so you think at Revelation and that final time and the new heavens and the new earth, what do you see coming down? You see the heavenly city, Jerusalem. It represents the very city of God. So it's a literal city, but it's a city that has meaning, a symbolism tied to it. And the same is true with Babylon biblically. It's a literal city, but it's far more than a literal city. In the Bible, Babylon comes to signify what the New Testament calls the world. It comes to signify all of the anti-God forces in the world. It is the city of man that is opposed to God. And so throughout the Bible, you have the storyline running of Jerusalem and Babylon clashing together, the city of God and the city of man clashing together. And that's what you have here in Daniel. It's this clash of Jerusalem and Babylon. On the surface, it looks like God's people are losing. It looks like God's city has been destroyed. It looks like God himself is losing. Again, it looks like their world is falling apart. In fact, one of the most poignant psalms in the whole of the Psalter is Psalm 137. And Psalm 137 is such a sad and moving psalm because it's written by those who are experiencing this exile. And the psalm begins by saying, we sat down by the waters of Babylon and we wept. And then the psalm goes on to ask a question. How can we sing the songs of God in a foreign land? And really, the book of Daniel is one long answer to that question. How can we sing the songs of God in a foreign land when our world is falling apart? And the book of Daniel is answering that question and reminding us that God is in charge. And that's a word of hope to God's people. Because even in the midst of judgment, it reminds them that their future and their fate is not tied to some Babylonian king, to some earthly king. That even in the midst of judgment, it reminds them that their future and their fate is in the hands of the God who made heaven and earth. And that this God is faithful to his word of judgment, and to his word of salvation. And so we take hope in that. You know, even as you come in here this morning, you feel like maybe your world is shattered. Maybe because of your own sin. Maybe it's because you're walking through something, it's a consequence of your own sin. Or maybe it's because of the sin of another. Or maybe it's just being part of this fallen world. And you think, how can I sing the songs of God in this city of man, in this fallen place? And Daniel's saying, remember that God is in charge. Remember that our future is in his hands. And if the book of Daniel doesn't quite convince you of that, then what you need to do is you need to look ahead some 630 years after Daniel. And look to that Roman cross outside of Jerusalem where the very Son of God himself would receive judgment for the sins of God's people, dying in their place for their sin, thus allowing his name to be dishonored and mocked and to once again seemingly endure destruction and defeat. And yet once again, God was in charge, and it was part of his plan. That's the first question. That's the first theme that we see here in the book of Daniel. Secondly, this morning, the book of Daniel is also about what it means for God's people to be a faithful presence in this world. And thus it helps us to answer the question, how should we live in this world? Okay, many of God's people, they've been exiled. It's God who's put them there ultimately. And the question now is, how should they live in this world, in this city of man, in this kingdom that's opposed to God and has sought to destroy God? It's not an easy question. It's the question, how do we maintain our convictions while at the same time engaging the culture? How do we maintain our citizenship in heaven and be faithful to God while living in this world, this Babylon? the city of man. Because you see, the way the New Testament speaks of Christians and of the church is that we are exiles. That's the very language of the New Testament for us. Peter in 1 Peter 2, he picks up on this imagery of exiles from the Old Testament. He says, we're like this. We are sojourners. We are exiles in this world. Meaning that we belong to the city of God and to God's heavenly kingdom, and that's our home. And yet we live in this world. We live in this Babylon, this city of man that's opposed to the city of God. And so that's the question. How do we live here? How do we live as citizens of God's heavenly Jerusalem? And yet for the moment we find our current home here in this world. I think Daniel is very helpful for us in trying to think through those things. Let me make just a few observations about what we learn from Daniel and his friends in this opening chapter. One observation is that this is a very serious challenge that every Christian faces. It was a very serious challenge for Daniel and his friends. Because the strategy of Nebuchadnezzar was one of what we might call seductive assimilation into Babylonian culture. Sadly, there are many ways in the history of the world that one people can oppress another people. And one of those methods is that of assimilation, right? Where you wipe out a people's previous identity as you slowly and methodically assimilate them into a new culture and give them a new identity. Nebuchadnezzar was a master at this. Look at how this unfolds for Daniel and his friends, verse 3. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. You see the strategy there. Nebuchadnezzar, he takes the very best and the brightest of Israel, and he isolates them from everything that they've previously known. And then he tries to essentially indoctrinate them into the ways of Babylon. He teaches them the Babylonian literature. He teaches them the Babylonian language. And this is a program that's going to last for 3 years. And not only that, but the young men, they're seduced with the rich royal food of the palace. They're not getting the scraps. Again, they're getting the luxurious things. And then in an attempt to completely wipe out their identity, they give them new names. Which is no small thing here, right? Names in the ancient world, they have meaning. They're meant to identify the person. They're meant to tell you something very central about that person. So Daniel's name means God is judge. His name is changed to Belshazzar, which means, O lady, wife of the god Bel, protect the king. Hananiah, his name is Jehovah is gracious. His name is changed to Shadrach, which means command of Aku, the moon god. Mishael, his name means who is what God is. His name is changed to Meshach, who is like Aku, one of the Babylonian gods. Azariah, his name means Jehovah is a helper. His name is changed to Abednego, which means servant of the shining one, Nebo. You see the point. The Hebrew names, they all refer to the one true living God of Israel, while their new names are meant to reflect the many gods of Babylon. You see, it's a forceful attempt to put God out of their lives. Imagine every day. For the first 13, 15 years of your life, you heard your name called and you knew that God was your judge. And now you hear your name called and one of the Babylonian gods is being referred to every single time they call your name. It's a sort of reprogramming. A new identity. That's the strategy. A new location, a new education, a new diet, and a new name, working to assimilate them into the Babylonian worldview of life. And I have to imagine that in some ways, for these four young men, this would have been tempting. I mean, they're teenagers, really, at this point. They got these new perks to potentially enjoy. They're in the magnificent city of Babylon. They're enrolled in King's College, Babylon, the Ivy League of the ancient world. They're on the fast track to political service in the king's court. It's all very seductive. And really, it's the same challenge, I think, for Christians, particularly in this part of the world today. Because our challenge isn't that we face imprisonment for our faith. It's not that we face execution for our faith. But instead, this is our challenge. It's the culture working to squeeze us into its own mold, making us conform to its values and its standards, pressuring to pursue the things that the world pursues so we don't stick out from the crowd. And perhaps the pressure's on at school or at work, to be like everyone else in the way that we dress or in the language that we use or in the things that we acquire. Perhaps we feel the pressure that we're to laugh at certain kinds of jokes and gossip about certain kinds of people or engage in certain forms of entertainment. Or if we want to get on and be promoted in the world of business, we feel pressured perhaps to leave our values and religious beliefs at the front entrance of our office so as to live a life entirely assimilated to the business community. Do you feel any of those pressures as you live your life in this world? All right, we have to understand that the world, this city of man, this Babylon, is relentlessly trying to teach how it believes we should think and feel and act. And it does this in some very obvious ways, but also does it in very subtle ways, where we just sort of become assimilated to the culture in the way that we view life, in the way that we view humanity, in the way that we view what it's all about. So this is a serious challenge for us to maintain our identity as the people of God. By the way, that's one of the reasons why Sunday mornings, when we gather together, are so important. Or if you're part of a small group Bible study, it's why it's so important, because what these times do is they remind us of our identity. Right? We come together and we're reminded of who we are in Jesus. And so we look at the Bible a lot. We've had 3 Bible readings this morning. We're listening to a longish sermon, but we need it. Because we need to be reminded of what does it mean to be a human being? And who is God really like? And how am I supposed to be living? We need to be reminded of these things. And we celebrate the sacraments. We have baptism. It reminds us, right, of what it means to follow Jesus and of the commitment that we're making, that it's giving everything and following Him. And we celebrate the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. It reminds us of what it cost for us to get into God's city. It's a reminder of the price that Christ has paid. We're reminded that we are united to Him, united to His death and united to His resurrection. We need to be reminded of who we are. There's a constant battle for our identity. That brings me to a second observation. Daniel and his friends saw the need to draw a clear line in the sand in order to remind themselves of their true identity. Okay, verse 8, if you look at verse 8, this is really the turning point in this story. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that the king drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Okay. Daniel draws the line in the sand when it comes to the food, and God blesses them. At the end of this test, 10 days, they come out looking better than everybody else all around them. Scholars have long wondered why it's here with the food that Daniel draws his line in the sand and says, no, sorry, we can't participate in this. Some people have wondered if it was perhaps because of Jewish kosher food laws that would have forbade them from eating the king's food. I'm not sure that's the answer. The problem with that is that there's no biblical regulation against wine, yet they refuse the wine as well. Others have wondered, therefore, maybe if it was because perhaps the meat and the wine had been offered to Babylonian idols. And they would that's what they would do. They would take the food in, they would place it before these wood, stone, metal statues, and everybody would leave, and they would come back, and the king got all the leftovers, which of course there were a lot because wood and stone can't eat things. And so the king always had lots of food. But the problem with that, though, is that you would assume the vegetables, too, would have been offered and sacrificed to the idols or presented to the idols in that way. So some have argued, well, maybe it's because Daniel was a vegetarian. So we should all be vegetarians. It's a real argument that people make. Which may sound good to you who are vegans, but it would be pretty anachronistic in the ancient Middle East. So I don't think any of those things are going on. Here's what I think is going on. Here's how one scholar summarizes what seems to me the best explanation. This scholar says, it's not so much something in the food that defiles as much as it is the total program of assimilation. At this point, the Babylonian government is exercising control over every aspect of their lives. They have little means to resist the forces of assimilation that are controlling them. They seize, therefore, on one of the few areas where they can still exercise control as an opportunity to preserve their distinct identity. So what Daniel and his friends recognize here is that they have to find some way to remain distinctive. They have to find some way to keep reminding themselves of who they really are and where their citizenship really lies. In order to keep themselves from being entirely smothered by Babylon and being entirely seduced by all that Babylon has to offer, they draw a line in the sand of the food and choose instead a less extravagant plate of food. Imagine every night you get a plate of peas before you. It's going to remind you this isn't the best there is. There's more to come. It's going to continually point them to their other identity. So they abstain. They fast from one particular thing in order to help keep them focused on their identity in God, which is perhaps something today's Christians need to do more of. Perhaps we need to say no to some things in the world so that we don't forget where our true home and our true identity really is. Friends, beware of indulging in all that the world has to offer. There's not necessarily anything wrong with the food and the wine, the meat and the wine, but it's a way of abstaining to say, my identity is over here, not in here. And yet a third observation is that Daniel and his friends don't say no to everything. I have to confess that I find it a little bit shocking that they choose to say no to the food, but not to the ungodly education that they had to sit through and receive day after day for 3 years. I mean, why not say no to that and just enjoy the steak and the glass of wine? I mean, that's what I would have done. But here's what I think it reveals. What I think it reveals is that while they were rightly determined to maintain their distinctiveness as God's people, I mean, after all, the whole reason Israel is in exile is because they failed to maintain their distinctiveness. They began worshiping anything and everything under the sun. They began to look like every other nation around them. And so Daniel is right to maintain his distinctiveness. We can't just worship whatever it is that the world is worshiping. And yet what I think we also see here is that that doesn't mean that they can't be good citizens of Babylon as well. Okay, notice they're not refusing, at least outwardly, to work for the Babylonians. They're not being excessively pig-headed. They're not being stubborn and difficult. They're not sort of calling down curses on the Babylonians and spitting on them and say, we'll have nothing to do with you. And in that, they're actually doing what God's prophet Jeremiah instructed them to do. By the way, the book of Jeremiah is immensely helpful in studying the book of Daniel because Jeremiah's talking to exiles and those who are going to be exiles, and he's giving instructions to those who are going to be in exile. And what you find in the book of Jeremiah is that there were some false prophets who were saying, don't worry about the exile. It's going to be over really quick. You'll be back home before you know it. But that wasn't what God was saying. And so God sends Jeremiah to speak the truth to them. What God was saying to his people is that you are going to be there for a long time. You're going to be there for 70 years. So settle in. This isn't going to be over quickly, he says to them. And so in Jeremiah chapter 29, he says, build some homes, plant a garden, get married, have some children, have some grandchildren. And as you do all that, make sure that you seek the welfare of Babylon. Because if there is peace and there's prosperity in Babylon, then you are going to know peace and prosperity yourselves as you live there. And so as far as it was possible for them, it seems that Daniel and his friends sought to work within the system in which God had placed them. They seemed to have understood it as the calling God had given them. Even though it was filled with all sorts of trials and temptations and pains and limitations, God had placed them in Babylon, and they had a constructive purpose there. I think the Christian church needs to be reminded of that deeply. It's a reminder for us not to form these Christian ghettos where we isolate ourselves from the world around us. Sometimes we do that as Christians, and we feel like I can maintain my distinctiveness more if I'm isolated from everything else all around me. And there could be maybe a good motivation to that, but it's not what we see biblically. And one of the ways that a number of different authors have spoken of what I think the Bible calls us to is they've used the phrase that we're to have a faithful presence in this world. Protestant and Roman Catholic authors both have used this phrase of having a faithful presence in this world, meaning that we need to be distinctive, we need to be faithful to God, and yet even as exiles, we're to be present in this world and helping to pursue the common good of the community in which God has placed us. We're to have a faithful presence. And so, look, part of that what that may reveal here is that that's going to look different for some of us. That we may not all answer that question or understand how that plays out in the same way. And it's going to take tremendous discernment to know what it is that we should say no to and what it is that we should say yes to. And again, we may not all agree on what that looks like exactly. Again, I think I would have taken the food and refused the name. Don't call me that. That's not my name. So we're going to need shared wisdom and discernment and humility with one another. And some of us are going to look around and we think, they're being way too liberal. They're being way too conservative. We're going to need patience with one another as we walk through and try to discern this. How do we be a faithful presence together in this world? Let me mention one more observation. A fourth observation is the manner in which these four young men carry themselves as they try to remain distinctive and be a faithful presence in this world. Again, I've already sort of hinted at this, but notice that they're not hostile. They're not belligerent. They're firm. Daniel firmly resolved in his heart that he was not going to eat the food. And yet he's respectful in the manner in which he seeks permission to refrain. And in fact, one of the things that we're going to see throughout this book is just how wise and shrewd these four young men are as they engage with the world of Babylon. And friends, we're going to need that same kind of wisdom and shrewdness if we're going to navigate the cultural waters in which we currently swim. There are landmines everywhere. And if we are not wise and shrewd, we're going to do ourselves more harm than good. Let me close with our third and final question. So again, first question, what do you do when your world is falling apart? Answer, remember that God's in charge. Second question, how should you live in this world? Answer, we're to be a faithful presence. And then our third and final question is this. As we look at this passage, and as we think about all these things, the question is, what in the world is God up to with all of this? What's the purpose of it all? Why has God placed them there? Why has He called them to live in this way? And the answer is found in that the book of Daniel is about the prevailing grace of God. Notice the result of Daniel's faithfulness and what God accomplishes through it. Verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. It's absolutely amazing. It's amazing how subversive God's grace is at times. At the end of the 3 years, here they are. They come in before the king, and they are better than everyone else. Daniel, we're told in that very last verse, he's there all the way to King Cyrus. Long after Babylon is gone, long after Nebuchadnezzar is gone, all the way to the year 539, Cyrus is now in. Who's still there? Daniel's still there. But here are these 4 young men, God's people now, in the very inner courts of Babylon, having an influential role upon the king himself and upon the kingdom there. Now, we shouldn't overstate that. God's plan after 70 years of exile, He said it from the very beginning, was that Babylon was going to be destroyed. So it's not like Daniel and his friends are making some huge, significant, wonderful changes in Babylon and the whole culture's changing. They're not transforming the culture of Babylon. But what they are doing is they are faithfully pointing people to the grace and the glory of God. And so much so that before it's all said and done, Nebuchadnezzar himself is actually going to bow the knee and worship God. And ultimately, it's very interesting. I don't know if you know the first time that the place of Babylon really comes into the picture of the Bible geographically. In verse 2 of this chapter, we're told that Babylon is in the land of Shinar. Now, at this point in Israel's history, the term Shinar to refer to a specific piece of land is well out of use. But Daniel uses it here, intentionally. And he's trying to tell us something. He's trying to point us to something. Do you know what else was in the land of Shinar? You have to go all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis chapter 11, what you find in the land of Shinar is the Tower of Babel. Okay, so you see what God's doing here. This is extraordinary. If you love the Bible, you love how it all hangs together, this is fun. Babel is the ultimate city of man opposed to God. All of the schemes and the plans of humanity against God find their place. They're in that building of the Tower of Babel. And what does God do? God brings judgment on Babel. But then God, in His grace, calls a man out of that very region, out of Ur of the Chaldeans, a man who would eventually be called Abraham. And to that man, God would make a promise that he would be the father of a nation. And that nation would ultimately be a blessing to the whole world. And now, in the sovereignty of God, even as God uses this worldly nation of Babylon to bring judgment upon His own people, He now sends back into that land emissaries who can declare the truth about God. In their very exile, you see, God is actually sending His people on mission into the city of man. Taking all of these events, He's weaving them all together. And it's very interesting that when Jesus is born, who should come and worship Him? None other than some wise men, some kings from the east, from this very land. Do you see how gracious God is? Do you see that what God's doing in all of this is ultimately achieving his salvation purposes? That's what God is doing in this world. Despite the fact that the nations have rejected him, he's fulfilling his promises to Abraham. Despite the sin of his own people, he's not letting his people go. He's continuing to uphold them and preserve them even though they're in exile, so that one day he can fulfill his promise of sending the true king, the Jewish Messiah, into this world. And so, friends, the book of Daniel wonderfully reminds us that the grace of God ultimately wins out. That Jesus has come to gather into the city of God a people for himself from all over this world, and that he has purchased us with his blood. We belong to him. Our allegiance is to him because he's bought us by dying for us. And he's called us to live for him as exiles in this place. And he's gone now to prepare a place for us in heaven. And his promise is that one day he will come again to take us to be with him in his eternal home forever. We will finally be home. God's in charge. He's called us to be a faithful presence in this world. And his grace has and it will prevail. Let's pray. Father God, as we stand before these truths from your word this morning, Father, cause our hearts to rejoice in you, in your wisdom, in your power, in your sovereignty, in your grace. Father, give us so much wisdom, we pray. Give us discernment as we move through this world that we might bring you honor and glory. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.